I want to welcome you all to this panel. We are going to change the order of presentation just slightly from the order that was given in the program. There's also a different there's a different setup online, the program online and the paper program. We're following the paper program. But the first presenter will be Gregor Walter Drop from the Free University of Berlin. And after that, we will follow in order Peter Katzenstein, Lisa Martin, and Tony Tam. And the reason we're asking Gregor to go first is that the origin of this panel, this roundtable, is a major research proposal on the topic of the liberal order under stress that comes out of the International Relations Group at the Free University of Berlin. And Gregor is here representing that group, and so we asked him to begin with telling us about the proposal, the conceptual distinctions that the proposal makes, and also about its notion of that the Free University would be kind of a web of research and inquiry around this issue. So we're going to begin with Gregor. I've asked each person to limit their remarks to 12 minutes, and I will be keeping time and waving my hands at you. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome to this roundtable. I'm substituting here today for Tanja Bürzel, who unfortunately couldn't come due to health reasons. And I'm here to introduce, exactly as Catherine said, the idea of a research center that we are applying for in Berlin. In my remarks, I will first introduce a little bit the idea of that center, what is it, and how is it going to be structured, who is involved, and so forth and so forth. And then I would like to introduce a couple of the substantive conceptual distinctions with which we worked in the proposal, which of course are open to discussion, and I'm very interested in hearing your feedback. First on the proposal itself. We are trying to establish a major research center under the title Contestations of the Liberal Script. It's not called liberal order, but it's called Contestations of the Liberal Script. It is a proposal which was filed under the so-called excellence strategy of the German government. And if it sees the light of day, it will be a fairly large research hub in Berlin. I should clarify from the beginning, it is not only Freie Universität that is involved, it's also the Humboldt University, it's the Social Science Research Center, WZB, and a total of 8 academic research institutions in the Berlin area is involved. And when I say it's a large center, I mean by it that the proposal was originally filed by 37 professors, and we believe that if we win the grant by the year 2022, there will be roughly 100 doctoral and postdoctoral researchers working at the center together with the various researchers. At the same time, it is not so much supposed to be a center, but rather a hub in a truly global network of research, because we are fairly convinced that contestations of the liberal script cannot be researched by a couple of white men in Berlin, but it has to be a truly global endeavor. This is why we are seeking to establish a global network of partnerships. We already have about 25 partner universities across the globe. Some of them are the usual suspects, such as Berkeley, Princeton, and Oxford, but some of them are definitely not the usual suspects, such as academic institutions from sub-Saharan Africa or from various countries in Latin America. So in other words, this presentation here is also an invitation to all of you and to a broader audience to watch out for this hub and eventually link in one form or the other to the research that we want to conduct. Yeah, if you have any further questions on the institutionalization of this center, please feel free to ask questions. The formal decision on this will be taken by the end of the month. So whether it will actually start its work on the 1st of January next year, we will know by the end of this month. If it is granted, it can run for a maximum of 14 years, 2 times 7 years. So in other words, we will get the funds for 7 years, and then we can reapply for another 7 years of funding. So it would run from 2019 all the way through 2032. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the substance of what we are doing. As I said, it's called Contestations of the Liberal Script. So it uses the idea of a script. Now, a script is supposed to be a set of ideas and institutional prescriptions about ordering society, basically. And we argue that what we call the liberal script is a particularly prominent one, and it involves the various factors you're all familiar with, from the market economy to democracy to the rule of law to human rights and so forth and so forth and so forth. This liberal script probably had its finest hour by the end of the Cold War. You all remember the idea of the end of history, where not in these terms, but the general idea was that this liberal script is sort of, I think it actually literally said, the end of human social evolution. It's just been 30 years, but from hindsight, it looks almost weird, and one could have thought that way. Because today, this idea, this liberal script, is under more pressure than it probably ever was before. And one of the special features of this pressure is that this pressure comes simultaneously from the inside and from the outside. Let me clarify a little bit what I mean by inside and outside, because I think there are at least two distinctions that are relevant here. The first one is you can think almost geographically about something like the realm of the script. That's supposed to mean that there are areas in the world where the appeal of the liberal script is strongest and where it's also institutionally most entrenched. We might call it the OECD world, but it's certainly not just the OECD world. So we are not particularly, we don't particularly like that terminology. Anyway, the point here is that we find contestants of the liberal script inside that realm, like, for example, the rise of right-wing populism, but we also find it outside the realm of the liberal script, like the secular rise of China, or also the ideas being thrown around by Russian President Putin, and so forth and so forth. So when I said earlier that the script is under pressure simultaneously from the inside and outside, you can say this is, you can argue that this is sort of a geographic notion, in a sense. It's sort of a realm of the script. But it is noteworthy that you can introduce a second distinction as to what's meant by inside the script and outside the script. One thing is to say you challenge the script for being inconsistent in a way. So in other words, you criticize it from the inside. And the idea here is that societal debate and contestation is actually a part of the liberal script itself, and always was. And the script has changed over the course of history, also in response to internal contestations of the script. Think, for instance, about the rights of women, and the way that today this is thought to be an integral part of the script, whereas 100 years ago it probably wasn't. So in other words, you can criticize the script internally, and an example for this would be an organization like ATTAC. ATTAC is making the argument that globalized capitalism is actually inconsistent and violating fundamental principles of the script. In other words, ATTAC does not want to abolish the notion of liberal order, but it actually argues that it has to be made more consistent. However, you can also find contestations of the liberal script that come from the outside in the sense, or that they are external to the script, in the fact that the criticism goes directly to the heart of core elements of the script itself. An example would be here, for instance, what we see in various countries such as Hungary, where fundamental elements like the independence of the judiciary or the freedom of the press are actually being called into question. This is not about making the script more consistent. This is actually a fundamental attack on the nature of the script itself. So in other words, these two distinctions, inside and outside, and internal and external, they basically form a 2x2 which structures our thinking about the kind of challenges that the script is faced with. So in other words, you can have actors within the realm of the script that criticize the script, such as attack, without calling it fundamentally into question. And you can also have actors inside the geographical reach of the script, of the institutional entrenchment of the script, that fundamentally call it into question, such as many right-wing populists, or I gave the example of the Hungarian President Putin. So this 2x2 structures our thinking about the natures of the challenges to what we call the liberal script. Let me say a couple of words about causes to these challenges or these contestations and the consequences. And basically these three elements, the nature of the contestations, their causes, and their consequences, structure the entire research agenda of what we want to do. So I talked already about the nature of the contestations. Let me say a couple of words about the causes. When we think about causes, we also work with a distinction that sounds a lot like the first two, and we call them endogenous and exogenous. Endogenous causes for these contestations is a little bit like this metaphor of sawing off the branch on which you sit. An example would be globalization processes. Globalization processes, free flow of information, people, capital, and so forth, is compatible with the liberal script, but may have led to various contestations, both social, about migration, and economic, that challenge or that give rise to challenges of the script itself. You know the narratives that economic globalization empowers or has made possible populism. You also know the narrative that mass migration has empowered populism in various countries, and there's actually no direct connection between the two. Just as a footnote, the strongest populist party in Europe is to be found in Switzerland, a country which is economically just fine. So simple economic explanations will probably not help in this regard. Rather, it's probably the perception of threat that we're talking about. So this would be an endogenous cause, because the script has itself given rise to its challenges. An exogenous cause, on the other hand, is simply factors which lie beyond the direct influence of the script, such as, for instance, the secular rise of China. The secular rise of China is in no way an outcome or a consequence of the liberal script. It is an exogenous development, which nevertheless now today poses a significant contestation in the sense that it appears to be a model of having economic prosperity without democracy. A link that hitherto was considered to be a necessary one and only to be found in the liberal script of how to organize societies. So this not only poses an intellectual challenge, it actually poses a very real political challenge. And we all know that this challenge is playing out, for instance, in many countries in Africa, where political elites might find a turn to the Chinese model quite attractive for various reasons. So in other words, when we think about the causes of contestations of the liberal script, we use these distinctions between endogenous causes and exogenous causes. Finally, a couple of words to our thinking about the consequences of what's happening. I mean, first of all, when you focus on the liberal script, you can say there are three logical options of what could happen. I mean, the first one would be the script adapts, as it has multiple times in the past. My example before about women's rights is just an example of how the script adapted to challenge. Another possibility, however, is a fundamental transformation of the script in which some of its core principles are dropped and others are added. That is also a logical possibility, and at some point we'll have to ask the question whether it can still be called a liberal script, but anyway. And the third and final logical possibility here is that there is a secular decline of the liberal script. That maybe in human history the era of the liberal script is over and maybe alternative scripts are on a secular rise and might prove eventually more appealing than the liberal script to a global audience than they have done so in the past. So when you just focus on the liberal script, you can say these are the three possible scenarios of what could happen. However, to make it clear how broad the challenges are that we think are underway, let me link the research agenda to 4 fundamental challenges. The first one would be the future of borders and the future of the nation state. What is the future of the nation state if cleavages, social, political, ethnic, religious cleavages become so strong that sort of the glue, the fabric that holds the respective societies together and that are necessary for maintaining a liberal order is dissolved or is not sufficiently there. Second, and very briefly, because I've used my time, what is the future of democracy if the cleavages are so strong and if so many people believe that democracy actually is run by alienated elites who self-serve their interests and at best ignore the public or at worst cheat the public? Third, what is the future of capitalism if more and more people feel it doesn't deliver and that the link to democracy is actually not a necessary one? See the example of China. And finally, what is the future of the planet as a whole if there is no script available that is able to reconcile sustainability and prosperity? As it stands now, the liberal script appears unable to do so if it doesn't fundamentally adapt, and I currently do not know of any other prominent script that would actually be able to reconcile this. Okay, so much for the substantive part. Thank you very much.
Tanya and Michael are powerful people. They put us in the spotlight so that they can observe what we are saying. For those of you who do not know how the Germans organize social science research, these are huge machines, okay, and millions of euros. And Tanya has done this before on a project on regionalism, which just finished after 14 or 40 years, and it was global. So there used to be an old German saying, which am deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genesen. The German character will solve all problems in the world. This is what this project is going to be, with modest questions about the consequences for democracy, the world, and the extraterrestrial, the galaxy, right? Yeah. So I read a draft of this proposal. It was wonderful, very well organized. And my main point was that the title was Contestations of the Liberal Script in the singular. And I said, Tanya and Michael, I'd add a little S. I think there's several scripts. And they said, that's a very good point. And so the final proposal has the title page, Contestations of the Liberal Script, bracket, scripts. Okay, so they punted, and which is, I think, relevant because there's so many people involved and there are probably deep disagreements whether it's a script or scripts. I talked to friends of mine who are in the theater world. This script is interpreted in different ways every evening. So the point about is it the singular or the plural, I will reinforce, and that's the basic point of my now 11 minutes, it's the plural. So the liberal order reminds me in some ways of the old adage about the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. That wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire, it wasn't German, and it wasn't a nation. And the same thing can be said about the liberal international order. It has served in the past very different purposes. It was racist imperialism in the 19th century. It's been contested multiculturalism since the 1950s. It has taken very different institutional forms, unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral, and it has adapted in periods of relative normalcy and crisis. There's nothing there in the singular. Okay, I want to talk now only about the present. First, on definitions. You think about order, the writing of Aron, Bull, Hoffman, and others. Theoretically, I think the concept of order means that states, since it is international, not global in the project, states are agreeing to norms, rules, and institutions that constitute them as actors and that regulate their behavior. It has both elements are a part of this project, I think. If you think about international order empirically, you look for the degree of consistency among different components of order. the degree of fit between formal and informal aspects of order, the relevance of habitual ordering practices, the degree of concentration of agency across different domains of order. So taking the concept of order and taking it apart and thinking about it, it will take 26 German professors to make this work, okay? It's a daunting but very important, I believe, very important scholarly enterprise. Now, for the concept of liberalism, one of the best articles I've read is by Duncan Bell in 2014. The basic point of the article is to say that the concept of liberalism is plastic, an ever-changing, all-purpose world that we cannot do without. It's a little bit like the concept of power. There is no trans-historical essence in that concept. And Walter alluded to this fact, but I would have made it more prominent. Over time, the meaning of liberalism has expanded greatly. Locke, as the ur-liberal, didn't exist as a liberal in the 19th century, according to Duncan Bell's analysis. There's been enormous expansion of the concept of liberalism in its meaning in the first half of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1950, when liberals battled fascism and communism. If you think about the rule-ordered liberal international order, which is prominent, including in this program for this year's convention, the concept was invented by Hillary Clinton in 2012. Okay? So our concepts do change over time. So the retrojective extension of the meaning is often very dangerous. So most of the time, liberalism has now become sort of a synonym for Western civilization. Duncan Bell's central point is that concepts are historically contingent, and this project out of Berlin is historically specific. It's not a trans-historical essence of liberalism. So I want to say a few things about the domestic liberal order in American foreign policy under the topic of pluralism, and very briefly then about the international liberal order, both after 1945. So the literature on American foreign policy talks about its multiple traditions, liberal America with multiple traditions. I think I see Henry in the audience. I can't really, Henry, you're there probably, right? So there are many, and Henry has added his own interpretation to the four canonical traditions of Wilsonianism, Jeffersonianism, Hamiltonianism, and Jacksonianism. There's no American liberalism. They're differently inflected versions of American liberalism. So we are today, possibly, it's not clear yet, in the, thinking about the military dimension, in the Jacksonian .2 version. The Trump foreign policy, has some resemblance rhetorically to the Bush one, but I personally think that Trump is a coward, and therefore that it's much less dangerous than the Bush foreign policy. But that remains to be seen. On North Korea, I think he's given away the store without getting anything in return. On Iran, he's hoping for regime change and collapse. Will he go to war over the issue of Iran? I doubt it. And on the Israeli-Palestinian, the grandest deal of all, he's stuck. So I think that the rhetoric of American foreign policy, of this Jacksonian liberalism, has changed, but its substance has not changed all that much. The Hamiltonian .2, trade foreign policy, is marked by a total lack of understanding about the relation between the trade and capital accounts. So Trump doesn't understand the capital account. He doesn't understand that if a society doesn't save, it will have to have importing capital. So the tax cut, of course, means that the capital account will widen, our savings rate is not increasing, and of course a booming economy means that we will import more than export. So that Hamiltonianism is not designed to reinvigorate the industrial base of the United States. There will be some short-term effects, but it will not change the structure of the political economy. In fact, Trump will extend, I think, the secular devaluation of the US dollar, which we have used, that is the United States, as a way of appropriating capital from other countries. We did it with Europe in the 1960s, Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, Japan in the 1980s, and with China since 2000. And it's a tidy sum. It's trillions of dollars, as the dollar has been devalued basically by 50 to 75% against major currencies. I see Trump as following that policy. The international liberal order, well, there were two. Before 1985, the great exception, looking at Rogoff's history of financial orders, it was 40 years of currency stability in an embedded, as John Ruggie writes about it, an embedded liberal order in which social rights were to some extent protected. Okay. There was concern about the domestic distributional issues and issues of state capacity. And it was anchored in international institutions which were made by the United States. Let's call them Bretton Woods. The disembedded political rights in the neoliberalism after 1945 is not anchored. And it's not concerned with domestic distributional issues. And that political fact is one of the major motivations for the Berlin Group, which looks at the battles over the liberal script. So the liberal order is under stress from the inside, as Walter rightly said. Right-wing nationalist populism, not the first time, but most pronounced in the United States and Britain right now, where neoliberalism was strongest. But this challenge is well on the way in Europe. And my personal judgment is if Macron fails, if that French experiment fails, it will have disastrous consequences for Europe in general. So the liberal order is also under stress from the outside, but I believe that is less central. Yes, there are strongmen in China, in Russia, and in Turkey, but they operate in weak regimes. And I think the legitimation crisis in China and the economic weaknesses in Russia and Turkey make these very dubious prospects for challenging the liberal order over the next 20, 30 years. We are in an era of what Jim Rosenau used to call turbulence. So what will happen in the future, and there I end? I don't know, you don't know, but the convention is full of people who say they know because they live in the world of risk. They have forgotten about the uncertainties of life. For most of the time, I think we live in a world of risk and uncertainty. The worldview which informs the innumerable number of panels on experimental design and methods is all Newtonian. It's all old-fashioned, outmoded Newtonian physics, okay, where we assign probabilities to uncertainties. But the 1930s metaphor in the public discourse about how we are returning to the Dark Ages, I think doesn't work either. I think there are radical differences in the political and economic orders between which distinguish us from the 1930s. I see rather the Latin American metaphor as the most promising for making me understand what's happening. We are, in the United States, becoming a Latin American presidential system. Populist, with a deep state, with a breakdown of norms, with an openness to authoritarian modes of governance, not just from the right. I believe this will also come in the next decade from the left. Latin American regionalism, of course, is more economic and social than security inflected. But I believe that the world order will pull the United States back into a reluctant United States back into the security realm. We want to rebuild our economic order. Trump, through international and domestic means, but a left democratic regime would want to do the same thing. But I don't think we'll be able to escape the security dynamics of the world and the challenges to the liberal scripts in the plural. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. So when I was thinking about what I might have to contribute to this discussion, I carved off a smaller slice of the big question about the liberal order, and I'm thinking specifically about challenges to multilateralism and multilateral institutions. And I have to say that my thinking on this is still very much informed by John Ruggie's edited volume from 1993, Multilateralism Matters. And as you probably all recall, what this volume did was to work with Ruggie's concept of multilateralism and then to explore the reasons that multilateralism prevailed in the post-World War II era, and why it took the form that it did, and then what kinds of challenges might arise to multilateralism. So if I could get my iPad to work, that would be better. Otherwise, it's going to be a very short talk. So in this volume, some contributors focused on, for example, the domestic reasons that multilateralism prevailed in the post-World War II era. There was a lot of great discussion about the norms and beliefs that were associated with multilateralism. But I thought it might be interesting at this point, 25 years later, to go back and revisit some of the arguments that were made in this volume and to see how well they hold up, and whether they might help us understand the current challenges to the multilateral order that we're seeing today. I'm going to approach this question very much from the American perspective, so not only taking a smaller slice of the big question, but also a more parochial approach to it. So I had a chapter in this volume, and what I did here was to take sort of a structural perspective and to think about why would the United States, in the position of dominance that it had right after World War II, choose multilateralism, and what may be some of the structural factors that lead to that. A lot of work in this volume was structured around this idea of the Hegemons Dilemma. And the version of the dilemma that was discussed here is that the hegemon, on the one hand, can exploit its allies, get a lot of short-term gains. But if you do so, that's at the cost of longer-term losses, right? If you do that exploitation, then you lose long-run benefits of stability, voluntary cooperation, lower transaction costs, and all of that. So one way to structure this question is, how do you understand when a hegemon would invest in multilateralism, right, which gives long-run payoffs, versus exploiting allies in the short term? And there are a number of different answers to this question, some of them, again, based in beliefs and norms and domestic structures. But basically, if we think of multilateralism as transferring some decision-making authority to your allies in these multilateral institutions, why would you choose to do that, right? Why would a hegemon choose to do that? There's many variations on this particular question, and it's been much theorized, right, over the decades since this volume came out, including by many of you in this room. But a large part of this question comes down to how farsighted is the hegemon, right? Is the hegemon very short-sighted, wanting to take these immediate gains that you can get from exploitation, versus, again, wanting to invest in the long run? Now, again, what I tried to do in this particular argument from 25 years ago was to focus on structural factors, and I worked with Joanne Gowa's idea that you would tend to be more farsighted in a bipolar setting than in a multipolar setting. So what Gowa is arguing is that in multipolarity, your allies have plenty of exit options, right? They can go form different alliances, and this is both in the security and the economic realm. Whereas in bipolarity, there are much fewer, the exit options are not attractive, right? And so if your allies are not going to be deserting you, if they're not going to be running off, forming different kinds of alliances, then you can sort of count on them, you can afford to invest in them and think more about the long run. I think that this sort of distinction does help us understand a lot of the dynamics of the Cold War quite well in terms of US policy during the Cold War. I think it also helps us to some extent understand why the choices that the Soviet Union made in terms of structuring its relations with its allies were so different than the choices that the United States made, right? Because the exit options for Soviet allies were more attractive than for US allies. And so you did not see that kind of, again, investment in multilateral decision-making structures. So this focus on exit options, I think, can be extended a number of ways, and some ways that I think do help us make sense out of the current set of challenges that we're seeing to the multilateral order. Both John Ruggie and Miles Kaler in the same volume really emphasized the striking fact that in the early post-war years, there was this, what they call an impulse towards universality. That is, we not only wanted to create multilateral institutions, but they tended, at least initially, to be very open membership, right? You wanted them to be as global as possible, as encompassing as possible. And then Kaler notes, in contrast, that by the time we got to, say, the 1980s, we see the rise of what he calls minilateralism, we see the rise of bilateral agreements, we see the rise of regionalism, and so on. So I think quite presciently, actually, Miles Kaler made the argument back in 1993 that in contrast to this movement towards smaller institutions, there was going to be a need for a return to what he called large N multilateralism, that there was going to be a demand for returning to trying to have these more open membership, more global kinds of institutions, partly just because of the kinds of challenges that, that are going to be faced. So he sort of argued that we would need to see a return to multilateralism in the future. But in spite of what Miles wrote in 1993, we have obviously continued to see a proliferation of minilateralism, right, of all different kinds of organizations that I have no idea that they want to be universalist in any such way. And I think some of the more ambitious attempts at reinvigorating large and multilateralism have obviously failed, right? I mean, trying to have a new WTO round has failed. You can have different perspectives perhaps in the Paris Climate Accord, but these really ambitious attempts have not really gone that far. And where we really have seen the sort of innovation and the establishment of functioning institutions has been on this much smaller scale. And this makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, creating large and multilateral institutions is extremely costly. There's very high transaction costs in creating these. There's massive distributional conflict and so on. And so it's very difficult to do. In addition to seeing the creation of these smaller scale institutions, we've also observed that the large multilateral institutions have actually become much more flexible, right? These are no longer one-size-fits-all kinds of institutions, but have different membership demands for different types of states and so on. So the upshot, I think, as we put this all together, is that it has been very practical to create these smaller scale institutions. There are functional challenges, there are regional challenges that states face, and they figure out institutional means to respond to those challenges. But the result of this in sum has obviously been a world in which there are a lot of exit options, right? You don't have to just join one particular multilateral institution. You pick and choose, you forum shop, you do all those kinds of things. When we combine this world now with many easy exit options with the rise of China in particular, I think that it's not surprising at all in the aggregate to see that the hegemon, if the US still could be considered a hegemon, the former hegemon perhaps, no longer has that interest in investing in multilateralism, right? Going back to the original argument. The more that your allies have attractive exit options, the more you're likely to take a more short-term perspective, not invest in those long-term institutions, and I think we see a lot of that going on. So I think that this world of many easy exit options really does encourage short-term thinking and discourages really a willingness on the part of the United States to invest in institutions that will only pay off in the long run, right, not in the short run. So just to wrap this up, I don't by any means claim to be providing an explanation for the foreign policy thinking of the current US president. I have no idea there. But I think this perspective does help us to understand why the president has been able to create coalitions in support of this particular foreign policy, right? Why there's clearly a domestic coalition that is supporting this turn on multilateralism, right? This disinvestment in multilateral institutions. And we perhaps are even starting to see this on the international level to some extent, that there is this turn against multilateralism. So I think that we do have a definitive move away from multilateralism on the part of the United States. And I would just simply say that when the president is doing this, I think he's pushing on an open door, which is why he's gotten as far as he has. There's just, again, there's a lack of incentive to invest in multilateral institutions that will only pay off in the long term. And I think that this is definitively then a crisis of multilateralism.
Well, I wonder, anyone also wonders why I am here. Am I the odd man out? Why would a sociologist specializing in inequality be part of the panel? The big question for this panel is about liberal order under stress. There's a highly political question, crying out for political answers. Who needs a sociologist to join the discussion? I wondered that as well. And when I was invited to join the panel, I thought, okay, that makes sense according to popular discourse. But after I started looking closer into it, I started getting nervous. I may be wrong, and many of the pundits may also be wrong. Economic inequality doesn't seem to be so obviously be relevant to the big question of challenges to liberalism. Fortunately, after looking further and deeper, I found that the puzzles, the empirical puzzles that shocked me at the beginning, turned out to give me clues into further understanding what might be really at work. Economic inequality, to put my story, my answer in a short sentence, does matter. Just that most of the popular discussions have confounded and conflated many not so important factors, and I will offer my own interpretation of what might be the crucial parameters. People talking about economic inequality and its relevance to the challenges to the liberal order should focus on. So to achieve that goal within 10 minutes now, I would divide my comments into two parts. The first part is to talk about 4 cases that also reflect my origin. I was born in Hong Kong, took my doctoral education at Chicago, and then worked at Harvard as my first job, returning to Taiwan with my wife, my Taiwanese wife, living there for a dozen years before coming back to Hong Kong and become a professor of sociology there. I've been living in East Asia for quite some time, particularly over the past 20 years, witnessing the historic changes that have been reported in the global media, both in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. I've observed those things really close. So that may give me the particular motivation and leverage to share some of my observations not commonly reported in the Western media. All right, my first part. Let's start with the notorious case, the United States, under Donald Trump. To me, as an outsider, really outsider, despite having been in the States for over a dozen years, I wonder how could this possibly happen in the United States? Fortunately, I'm not alone. Many of the insiders like you wonder what the heck has happened over these past 10 years or less than 10 years that escaped the radar of so many scholars, even at this convention. To me, Donald Trump, United States under Donald Trump represents a frontal assault on the liberal script, no matter which version of script you're talking about. It may prove to be part of a process seeking to dismantle the liberal order from its very core, from within the most central political institution of the leading liberal democracy in the 20th and 21st centuries. There are many political answers, obviously. What about economic inequality? To me, the relevance of economic inequality as part of the explanation is quite dubious. Think of it this way. Economic inequality has been a central feature of American capitalism for a long time, and has been around since the founding of the nation. It's gone through ups and downs. It's always been there. By World Bank's computation, Gini coefficient for the United States is just about 41 in 2013. If you use census estimates, well, Gini coefficient has gone up over a period of 45 years from pretty low of 0.35, 35% to 45 in 2012. That may sound troubling to you, but by global standard, this is just nothing much important. You may also heard a lot about the top 1% and the top 0.1%. That sounds disgusting, right? Just think about what happens in other parts of the world where there's no or little challenges to the liberal script. So if you look at the economic literature, by economics account, the whole country has prospered a lot from its economic inequality. If you eradicate economic inequality from the American economy, it will be it will be a much, much worse country than it has been. So, is it really so important? Part of the story for the case of the United States? Well, let's look at another case, Taiwan, a newly founded liberal democracy, oftentimes cited as maybe kind of a poster child representing the future of East Asian countries, the future of liberalism in East Asia. Well, Taiwan is certainly one of the miracle economies. For many years, it has a very low level of economic inequality. And by low, I mean it barely got to 30.34 in 2014, according to CIA's statistics. That's very modest, nothing to be alarmed about. But despite such a miracle economy, the strength of liberalism, or the global applause for its economic openness, Taiwan has gone through a terrible time over the past 10 years. Talk to people who actually live there. I left Taiwan at the turn of its going down, returned to Hong Kong, my hometown. What happened in Taiwan? One thing is interesting. All the grievances you heard are not made by working class citizens, but by the middle class, especially the highly educated middle class in Taiwan. They are challenging and contesting precisely the interpretation of the liberal script, the liberal order, by the so-called DDP party, which is the new, becoming the largest party, overtaking the nationalist party, which corresponds to the Republican in the United States. People are arguing that the DDP is not offering a proper version, interpretation, and translation of the liberal script in Taiwan. Instead, they're abusing it to do political battles. I will not get into detail, but the long story, put it short, is the new middle class and the educated class in Taiwan are so pissed off by both parties. They think the current government, despite its liberal institutions, are not functional at all. They hate both. And for that reason, they are kind of challenging. They're challenging not so much liberalism, but the interpretation of liberalism. That echoes Peter's earlier point about liberal script should be plural. That happens exactly in Taiwan. Let me quickly go to the case of China. China is an authoritarian state witnessing breathtaking pace of rising inequality. It has always been authoritarian, no matter how open it may be on the economic front. Its Gini coefficient has risen over a period of 30 years from a very low of about 0.3 to a high of 0.55. That was not the statistics according to official statistics, but the latest articles published in the proceedings, PNAS, compiled a new set of estimates that seems to be highly robust and credible, pushed the current rate of Gini coefficient to be at 0.55. That's very high. And it developed this escalation of inequality over a matter of 30 years. Why didn't China collapse? Why didn't it? Why are there so many nationalists protecting an authoritarian regime? I would have liked to comment a little about Hong Kong, but since I'm running out of time, let me jump to my part two, focusing on what I see to be the crucial parameters that make economic inequality so powerful and consequential in the current challenges to the liberal script or liberal scripts. The first is economic inequality in itself does not hurt. It will hurt only when it creates. It does not always create, but if it creates relative decline, significant relative decline in the economic well-being of its citizens, then it creates problem. Secondly, if the decline creates a unified experience among a large enough segment of the population, then it can create problem for the liberal order. And finally, a highly sociological point. It also depends on whether the unified experience somehow got translated by some political entrepreneurs into a coherent identity for those people who get hurt. So 3 key parameters. Number 1, relative decline is the key, not absolute dire economic condition. If the decline is coupled with a fall in economic security, that will make it all the worse. But relative decline, big economic decline is the key. The second and the third one is about translating such decline into collective action. Requires shared experience, sufficiently shared experience, and sufficient entrepreneurship to translate it into a common identity among the victims. Short of any of this, economic inequality will not create problem, just as it had been the case in mainland China. Despite all the escalation of economic inequality, it creates upward experience, relative upward experience for everyone. It's also the case for Hong Kong, a highly conservative society for a long time, because upward mobility has been the name of the game for a long time, until lately. So let me wrap it up. With all those 3 parameters in mind, I think I can understand why the United States got into trouble, why China and Taiwan also got into trouble, and why China and Hong Kong has not been in trouble for so long. Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank the panel for very thoughtful and succinct and thought-provoking comments. So we're going to open it up to you now. Because we can't really see you, I'm going to try to call on you, but please do identify yourselves.
Berlin program, which I think we got a little away from some of the comments. It's a very interesting topic, set of topics. Is there a theory that you're working with that doesn't seem to be a causal interpretation or a theoretical argument here, just a general concern with the big problem that's affecting all of us right now and that we're all thinking about? Is that the idea, to let 1,000 flowers bloom and let various faculty and postdocs pursue their own ideas, or is there an encompassing theoretical structure to this project?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think at this point it's not that we have a grand theory where we think it all hangs together and which would allow us for clear-cut projections about the future. That's certainly not the case. However, Peter Kassenstein was quite right to point out that if it sees the light of day, it's going to be a fairly large structure. The internal structure of this is going to be 4 substantive so-called research areas. One is called borders, one is called orders, one is called allocation and reallocation, and the final one is called temporality. And across those, there are going to be 3 units that are trying to put it all together. One is called the Methodology and Data Center. One is called a Knowledge Exchange Lab, where we work with practice institutions. And one, and that's the answer to your question, is called the Theory Network. The Theory Network is supposed to bring all the insights from the various projects that will be run in the context of the center together, exactly in order to allow for theory building. This is certainly not going to be an easy task. Moreover, that I failed to mention in the beginning, that this is not only a political science thing. The special characteristic of the center is going to be that it will bring together comparative social sciences, such as political science, sociology, history, law, and so forth, together with experts from various fields of area studies. And obviously, the theoretical contributions of these people are going to be very, very different. And of course, it will be no easy task to bring it together on a more abstract level. But yes, it's definitely an explicit goal that after a couple of years, we have made headway with regard to theorizing what we call the contestations of the liberal script.
Can I just say something?
Of course, yes.
I mean, since the previous project on regionalism produced, I think, over 700 publications, and it was a subject on which I had written a book 10 years earlier, I wrote to Tanya and said, Tanya and to Thomas, give me the 5 top contributions that I read and see whether it adds something to what I've written. And I'm still waiting. But I think that it's an unfair, the implication is not to be unfair. I think the theorizing, especially if in fact you succeed in making it a global hub. You know, I just looked at the book on epistemologies of the South. You know, will counteract your 2x2. It will counteract all of your methods. It will turn you upside down in many ways, and that may produce something new. But I think that something new will come out of individual heads. This is a machinery. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a machinery. It was huge. Every part moved, but the machine didn't move, right? And that, I think, is what's likely going to be the prospect for this project.
Yes, please, can you come and use the... Yeah, we're going to need you to use the mic up front here.
Bob Neuer of Peter Lang Publishing. I'm wondering if you consider the role of demography in this project, and in particular, it's kind of curious the vitality of these populist movements, particularly in Europe, where, as I understand it, there's stagnant or declining populations, and is there new vitality on the part of senior citizens, or?
Yeah, well, a significant number of the scholars who are currently involved in the overall project are in fact sociologists, and obviously some of them also do research on issues of demography. However, at this point it would be certainly too early to say something that we are witnessing the political epiphenomena of demographic change. I think there's much more to this. So I'm sure it will be considered, but it will be certainly not the only factor. However, if you think about global research, and let me echo here what Peter Katzenstein has already outlined, and it is supposed to be an endeavor of global research, you need to look into different parts of the world. I'll give you an example. One of the projects, you know, we have sort of, the cluster is like a structure that holds together various individual research projects, dozens of them actually. And of course, obviously at this point, because the final decision on the cluster has not been taken, we haven't spelled out all the individual projects, but obviously we have developed some ideas. And one of them is a specific project on Western Africa. And it will look at the youth in Western Africa. And there are a couple of very interesting cases where you can probably say that the liberal script, more or less, or the prescriptions of the liberal script have failed entire generations. You have various countries in Western Africa which have an entire generation that's fairly well educated, following the meritocratic narrative of the liberal script, with no chance whatsoever. And the project that we plan will investigate what's the reaction. Is the reaction migration? Is the reaction political radicalization? And so forth and so forth. And what does it depend on? So demographic change is not something that's exclusive to Western Europe or the Western world, but it's also something that affects other parts of the globe and indirectly influences the standing of that liberal script. By the way, can I make one remark to the question of script or scripts? I think at this point it would be rather dangerous for us to give up the notion that there is one script, because we would basically argue that the thing we want to investigate doesn't actually exist. That's a dangerous argument to make if you face reviewers. What, however, I could easily live with at this point is to say, sort of in a Platonic sense, there is an idea that's coherent, which is interpreted de facto in very different ways. Take the example of reallocation. Reallocation is actually a core element of that liberal script or the economic order in the liberal script, but it's interpreted in very different ways in the United States on the one hand and Sweden in the other. But it's the same underlying idea that redistribution actually fulfills a very important stabilizing function for the system as a whole. However you do that and to which extent is a different question. But on the global scale, again, the differences are relatively small.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Ari Katsovic-Ibru, University of Jerusalem. A comment to Peter, and maybe I would like also to hear Catherine on that you mentioned that the USA is finally into the Americas, right? The USA is joining the Americas. So whether that's too bad of a perspective in international terms, looking at the Americas as a region of peace. And the question to all of you, Barry Buzan last year at the WISC in Taiwan gave a wonderful lecture for 1 hour talking about moving the international order from the Anglo-Saxon liberal order into another version of Groshan. The international order will persist. So my question to you may be the case, maybe it be the case that the liberal order is contested domestically, as Peter, you said, but in international terms, it would adapt. Interrogation mark, whether you can comment on that. Thanks.
Well, since you invite me, yes, Peter's comments. I thought at first there was going to be a better spin on Latin America, and you gave us a little bit the kind of the Banana Republic version, which doesn't.
I defer to the chair.
And so, so what does Latin America have to say to this? I would say, one, we have a region that, despite, many difficulties, it continues to be mainly democratic, a region that was entirely authoritarian, 20 years ago, with some exceptions like Venezuela. You have a region that has experienced economic growth, which also is in contrary to what happened during the entire period of the 70s and the 80s, the period that I originally studied. That part of that economic growth has come as a result of some liberal economic policies, liberal, as opposed to the import substitution of the earlier period, that Latin American countries have learned that they can use social policy effectively to counter the some of the costs of those open economic policies. So in the best of the worlds, and I'm talking, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, all brought down not only poverty, but Brazil, at least under the Lula government, and Uruguay definitely, has also brought down inequality. And they've done it with social policy. They've done it with these conditional cash transfers. Uruguay, where I spend a lot of time, and Ari knows it well, this is a country that's giving one computer to every child in the public school system, for example. They've done it through education policy. They've done it through health social policy. So I want to suggest that the Latin American model is not as kind of desperate as you suggest, that yes, there's right and left-wing populism. Yes, the United States might, accept its own imperfection, and that we have had in the past. By the way, populism is not new in this country. Either left or right-wing populism is not new in this country, and we have it again now, and so does Latin America. But I'm not sure that that means the banana republicization of the US.
So I think the banana republics are in Central America. So the Central America is part of the Americas. The Latin Americanization of our presidential system will remain democratic, but the tolerance for going off the mode has to be much greater. And that will be towards the left as well as towards the right. It will involve the deep state in forms in which we are just beginning to acquaint ourselves. But then structurally, what is important about the Americas is that the United States in this world of regions was a regional power in all other regions, including Latin America, but it ran only one region, Central America. And that's the disastrous outcome, right? So in Latin American regionalism, it was the conflation of being the regional dominant power and the global power. That makes the Americas different from East Asia, from Western Europe, from Eurasia, where the United States has always been a regional power. So the structural position means that the Americas provide a particular place for the United States, and the United States will not be able to rest its ship there. We will be drawn into world politics whether we want it or not.
Yeah. By the way, I want to make sure that the audience knows we are continuing to look at you and waiting to see, encouraging you to come to the microphone.
But
Yes.
they're really difficult to see.
How about the second question about an international order that is liberal order contest domestically, not internationally? The question that anybody wants to refer to.
Well, yeah, I mean, right now you see the adaptability of the liberal international order in the sense rallying against Trump. You see it with European-Japanese collaboration, right? You see it in Australia, China. But it depends on whether this is a passing phenomenon, 2 to 4 years, or whether it lasts longer. I think it's just too early to tell.
And maybe if I just could say one thing about that. You mentioned alternatives to the Anglo-Saxon version of the order. To me, what is striking is that even as Asian states, for example, create new institutions, they look exactly like Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, the form that these institutions are taking, there is no alternative, apparently, out there. They look exactly like the institutions that were created in the 40s and 50s. Now, it's possible, as I think Tony was suggesting, that the way these institutions operate in practice may be different, right? But at least the form that they're taking in the negotiations is, there's nothing novel or creative there. It's mimicking, right, what has the existing order.
But I think if you look at multilateralism in Africa under Chinese auspices, it's very different how it operates. It looks like it's multilateralism, but in fact it's bilateral deals. They all come together for the final banquet. But so the Chinese use it, but they use it and deploy it in very different ways.
My question is about climate change, and to what extent I see that climate change is already a major stress to the liberal order, in the sense it's already generating migration, and certainly over the next 14 years of this research center, we're going to see enormous strains as Calcutta goes underwater and Bangladesh disappears, or half of Bangladesh. And I'm wondering if this is the crisis that could strengthen multilateral organizations and solidify a liberal order, or alternatively spell a demise to the liberal order. Have you, as members of the panel, thought about that?
Yeah, well, actually, I would agree. I mean that the question of climate change, as a broader part of the issue of sustainability, is one of the testing stones of the liberal script. Actually, is it possible to reconcile the challenge that comes with climate change and not only the actual consequences that we can no longer stop, but also the broader implications of stemming the tide, quite literally in that sense? Can that be reconciled with an adaptation or transformation of the liberal script, or can it not? So I would say that is indeed one of the core questions.
So, I'd like to take the panel actually back to Bob Cohane's question. Oh, except we have I reserve the right to take us back to Bob's question, but we have a question, another comment right here.
Just because it's a direct follow-up to the climate change
Yes,
question.
please.
I've been trying to, at various professional conferences in sociology and political science for 3 or 4 or 5 years, trying to convince people that climate destabilization is now so bad and so unsolvable that it completely threatens everything, including all forms of liberalism, and that it's something that has to be on the front burner all of the time from now on if our grandchildren are not going to live in hell, and our great-grandchildren in particular. And the science on this at this point in time is absolutely undeniable. So I would say that your project of this major research effort will be faced with a situation in the next, I mean, it's happening now. I live in Northern California, which has been absolutely on fire and burned to the ground in many places, at the same time as you're being drowned in various parts of the East. This is going to get worse and worse and worse every year, right? And yet, our basic crisis and failure of liberalism is that liberal intellectuals, professionals, the modern middle class, not just the Republicans, not just Trump and his people, refuse to look this reality in the face. We all instead work in our little specialties, our silos that we love and are committed to, and we're going to have to change that. Increasingly. So this is a major opportunity and task for such a big, new, well-funded research project to play a major role in the reorientation of the social sciences, of academia, of the public intellectuals, of all of that social capital. And I would argue that it's going to become increasingly clear to any rational person within the next year after year after year after year that, this is an existential crisis, the like of which the human species has never seen, and it's not going away.
Lisa, you mentioned, I was going to say, Lisa mentioned the Paris Accord and the kind of the failure of the Paris Accord as being one of the sort of crises of, would you like to add to your remarks, sir?
Well, not so much to say about that, but just, one additional dimension of the consequences of climate change I just want to put on the table. Besides the disruptions from migration and so on, climate change is going to lead to a fundamental revaluation of assets around the world, right? California may be much less valuable in the future than it is today. And I think that, again, the liberal order rests on a certain predictability and stability, right? And to the extent that you're getting fundamental revaluation of assets, both domestically and on a global level, that's going to make it very difficult for economic institutions to cope. So I see that as one of the major challenges, and again, as something that may spell the demise of the liberal order as opposed to bringing it together.
Sorry, Peter, you had something.
I just wanted to say there couldn't be a better place for organizing this research in Berlin. I think the awareness of the environment as a political issue in Germany is qualitatively different from the United States. So in that sense, I think we are in better hands than we would be with a project at Cornell or at Harvard or Berkeley. Right.
Well, actually, you made me think about, we have a large climate research institute just outside Berlin, and you made me think about how we could collaborate with them. It's probably a good idea.
Yes.
I'm Cliff Bob from Kane University. I have a question, I guess, mostly for Professor Tam. I thought your conclusion was really interesting, the way you talk about inequality leading to significant, or decline leading to significant, a relative decline in economic well-being, and then whether or not this creates a unified experience, and in turn, whether a political entrepreneur translates this into some sort of identity and collective action. So I'm just wondering if you can expand a little bit on how that might occur. And also, to the extent it has occurred, to me it seems that it's mostly an identity and action that's directed at the weak, the outsiders within these societies, immigrants, rather than at the people who are sort of at the top of the inequality that's created. And so it seems a little strange in some ways. Why is it that it's directed that way? And is there, I mean, obviously there are some more left-wing populist movements, but they don't seem to be as effective as the right-wing ones. And I guess in one sort of different question, but related in a way, is, I mean, so much of what we hear about now with regard to the rise of right-wing populism has to do with its external causes. I mean, the role of Russia, to some extent, seems to be always mentioned. But no, when I was here, I didn't hear anything about that, and Professor Katzenstein focused on the domestic sources of a lot of this turmoil. So I was wondering if anyone could comment on the extent to which that might also be a factor.
I think thank you for the question. I think you are putting a finger on whether my theory, kind of, theoretical framework, can make predictions about grievances and challenges coming from both lower and upper, both insiders and outsiders. I think it's contingent. Anything can happen. In the case of the United States, it's not migrants, it's white Americans, working class in rural America and small town America that are the strong support for Trump's rebel, his coup. Whereas in the case of, say, Taiwan, it's not the working class who are challenging the government, the interpretation of what liberalism should look like. It's the educated, the middle class, who have witnessed a huge decline in their economic prospect and the prospect of their children. They had a terrible time because the government can totally renegade their promise for pension schemes, beneficiaries. That sort of thing is unheard of in a liberal democracy. And in Hong Kong, is widespread. It's both the lower class and the middle class who suffer from the housing bubble that hurts so many people that they become the strong supporters, including the umbrella movement. But as the umbrella movement translates into economic disadvantages for the professionals, they turn against the umbrella movement secretly, quietly. They may provide moral support, but never in action because their companies, their jobs are jeopardized by dragging on the umbrella movement, dragging on for too long. All these illustrations are to tell you in one sentence, anything can happen. It's not restricted to migrants. It's not restricted to lower class. It can happen in many ways, depending on how the economic shock hit different segments of whether it hit a large segment of the population in a unified way. Housing bubble in Hong Kong hits everybody.
Thank you. So even though Baba has now left, I do want to return us to this theory question because I actually think the panel had more to say about theory and that this may be something we'd like, Gregor, to take back to your team in Berlin, and that is, a number of hypotheses and arguments been made. Lisa reminds us of the importance of really sort of realist issues around balance of power issues and bipolarity versus multipolarity as one possible explanation of changes of approaches around multilateralism. Tony has talked to us about economic causes, and there's a lot of hypotheses out there about structural economic cause of these stresses. But he also reminded us that the simplistic version, which is it's all inequality, stupid, driving everything, is really not very persuasive, and we have to look at it more complex ways. And that it may be this question really of economic decline and the well-being of citizens that's more important than inequality per se. Peter helps us by reminding us the importance of uncertainty and contingency in these issues, so that these more kind of structural causal explanations, we need to be aware that we don't really know, we might not know. And I just want to add to that on contingency and uncertainty, one of the things we haven't mentioned, and this to Tony's question about how did this happen, we keep asking ourselves, but we know it isn't just inequality in the United States influencing classes of people. We know it's that we have 3 states where less than 1% of the margin of the vote carried the election. And we know that in those 3 states, well over 40% of the eligible voters simply didn't show up at the polls. Now that's a liberalism question too, and that is, why is it that so many people in this country didn't feel that that election was important enough, including so many progressive people in this country felt that that election wasn't important enough to go to the polls. And the uncertainty and contingency continues to be very present because, what happens in the midterm elections, could make an important difference here. And so I think that reminder about contingency is important. And just finally, to kind of bring in the constructivist lens, Tony also reminded us that this is about political. It's not just about inequality and economic outcomes, it's about political entrepreneurs capable of making coherent narratives. And I would like to add to that, it's also very much about expectations versus outcomes, right? And that is, it's not the working class in Taiwan, it's an educated middle class that's asking these hard questions about their system. And some of what's going on here, I would like to say, is what Albert Hirschman called fracasomania, and that is that there's a great failure complex. And part of it is that this is really hitting the US, the UK, and Western Europe hard. And so all of a sudden, the sky is falling because we are experiencing things that other parts of the world have experienced, and in some cases, like Latin America, have partly overcome. Okay, but this American exceptionalism, because something very unexpected happens here, the sky is falling. So I just want to add one little issue of, I do think that we have to be aware of the expectations are as important as the trends. The perception of the trends is as important as the trends itself. And so even though we have trends moving in directions which might be positive, the perception of the trends is of hugely negative developments in the world, which may not always be sustained by the evidence. And so I think the constructive perspective that's very present, of course, in your Berlin group will be useful to really think about how much of this stress on the liberal order has to do with expectations rather than genuine global trends. So we have a very few moments. I don't know if anyone in the panel would like to make a final remark. Yes, as well as Walter, yes.
Can I make a final comment? So I actually would like to put out a hypothesis out there that maybe someone in this very large project could take on. So I think when we consider the question of what accounts for the rise of nationalist populist movements, which we see obviously within the United States, Western Europe, I think we also see within India, right, other parts of the world. And I think one prominent hypothesis out there is that the collapse of the compromise of embedded liberalism is partly what's accounting for this, right? As you've shredded the social welfare net, that is partly what accounts for the rise of these movements. I would like for someone to really look at that carefully on a cross-nationalist basis, because my gut sense is that that isn't right. I mean, I don't necessarily think that the places where we've seen the most destruction of the safety net is where we actually have seen these populist movements arise. I could be wrong, but I can think of a lot of exceptions to that. So I just think that's a prominent hypothesis that would be great to explore in the context of this larger project.
Anybody else before we give the last word to Gregor?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take a lot of ideas back to Berlin. The important part is for all of us to wait for the end of this month when the final decision will be taken whether we are going to win this grant. I'm fairly optimistic, but you can certainly not be sure. if it sees the light of day, and I'll invite you all to check the press releases of the Free University in Berlin, because if we do, it will certainly be rather prominent. I invite you all to continue this discussion with us. It is supposed to be not only international, but supposed to be a truly global endeavor, including, and I reflect on what Peter Katzenstein said earlier, including a critical view on the script that we follow in conducting research, and deliberately wanting to have things turned upside down, as you put it, in that global discussion. So I invite you all to look for the center, to approach us, to become part of the network. Thank you very much.